Okay, if you would please find your seat, we can begin. I want to welcome you to this public session for the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics, just so you know where you are. I'm Nancy Zimfer, the Knight Commission's co-chair, and I'll be sharing facilitation of this session with our co-chair Lynn Elmore, and on behalf of our other co-chair, Arnie Duncan, who is with us remotely. First, we want to thank the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation for their support of this meeting and of the Commission's efforts throughout. A few points as we begin this session. The session is being broadcast via Zoom, and a video link for replay will be available on knightcommission.org later this week. Commission members and panelists should use the microphones when speaking. A number of Knight Commission members, including, as I said, Arnie Duncan, are participating via Zoom. We're pleased to have media and others participating via Zoom to hear this discussion, some present with us. The slides shown during this session and other meeting resources are available again at knightcommission.org. Media are reminded that we will hold a press conference at 12:45 where we will entertain further questions on your part. This session will explore recommendations for altering two key components of the NCAA annual revenue distribution to institutions: athletic performance incentives and academic performance incentives. This first part of the session will focus on the athletic performance incentives and reforms proposed in this aspect of the NCAA revenue distribution. As background, the NCAA awards 28% of its annual revenue distribution, more than $160 million, based on men's basketball team wins and participation in the NCAA Division I tournament, and awards $0 for the performance of any women's teams in any sport. The Knight Commission's proposed financial care model, released in September of 2021, recommends that the NCAA implement a gender equity principle in its revenue distribution formulas that would require any athletics performance-based revenue distribution to provide equal rewards for the performance of women's and men's teams. Today, we will hear from Roberta Kaplan, founding partner of Kaplan, Ecker, and Fink. Roberta, by nickname, your bio can be found on the session summary provided in the meeting materials. In 2021, the NCAA Board of Governors asked Kaplan Ecker to conduct an independent gender equity analysis of the NCAA championships. The report found glaring inequities between the men's and women's NCAA March Madness tournaments, and many of the firm's recommendations were acted upon. One of the remaining items in the NCAA revenue distribution plan, which is the focus of this session, will be talked about by Roberta, joining us remotely. And I will say that Roberta has been incredibly helpful to the Commission's work as well, and we appreciate the long haul and your presence with us today. So I'm thinking that I did see you, Roberta, and I hope you will return.
Thank you for having me.
There you are. So thank you, Roberta.
So should I start?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so look, none of this is all that complicated, but let me kind of give everyone the background. So everyone probably remembers or may remember what happened at the 2020 NCAA women's basketball tournament. It was at the height of COVID. Both tournaments, both the men's tournament in Indianapolis and the women's tournament in Texas, were happening simultaneously within what people refer to as a COVID bubble, in the sense that there were no spectators, and the teams, even for the earlier rounds, were all together in one place under COVID restrictions. As a result of that kind of unique set of circumstances, it became apparent that the conditions at the women's tournament in Texas were far, far different than the conditions at the men's tournament in Indianapolis. And the tweet, as we refer to it in our report, the tweet heard around the world was, I'm not even sure whether it's a tweet or an Instagram post, but the post that Oregon player Sedona Price put up showing the difference between the weight rooms for the men and the women in Indianapolis versus Texas. And that after that, kind of a huge outcry arose, and many other issues came up, including differences in swag bags, differences in branding and appearance of the court, differences in sponsorship, believe it or not, even differences in the food that was given to the players. And we were brought in, we were retained by the NCAA to do an independent investigation. What I mean by that is we have committed, and NCAA has committed, that we would not do any work with the NCAA after this for a number of years, and we've never previously worked for them. So we were called in to do an independent review of the problems that appeared to exist at that point in time with respect to gender equity for the women's Division I tournament. And we wrote a huge report. The report just for basketball alone is over 100 pages. I could give everyone the website, it's still up, ncaagenderequityreview.com. And so there's a lot of detail on there. It discusses a lot of issues. We then went on to do a second phase report covering all the other tournaments other than basketball. And that's in the second report, also on the same website. But the one issue relevant today that we looked at was the NCAA's revenue distribution model. And frankly, it's not complicated. The issue isn't complicated. How to solve it maybe is. But the issue isn't complicated. As you've already heard, a huge percentage, and if we could put up the first slide. No, second, next slide. Yeah, could everyone see that slide?
Yes. Yes.
So a huge percentage, it's basically the big green box or pie slice, I guess I would call it, that says basketball fund, and the blue slice just above it, this is equal conference fund. All those monies are distributed every year back to conferences and then ultimately to schools based on what I would call a merits-based criteria for men's basketball. And what that means is for the blue piece of pie, any conference that has a team participate in the men's championship gets money. And for the even bigger green slice, the 168 million, that is rationed out based on relative performance at the tournament. So the men's championship team gets the biggest slot to their conference, et cetera, et cetera. And why I say the issue is so simple is if you try to draw a pie chart with respect to how revenue is distributed for women's basketball, there would be, both of those pieces of pie would be zero. There's no sum of money currently distributed by the NCAA to women's basketball, either for participation in the tournament or for relative performance in the tournament. So looking at this through a gender equity lens, it seemed to us that this is obviously a problem. It's a problem because it obviously symbolically sends a terrible message. It's hard to think of a stronger message that men's basketball matters in terms of getting financial rewards and women's doesn't. It's a problem in terms of trying to encourage schools and conferences to invest in their women's game. And I should say that we were lucky enough to be able to attend this year's championship back in March in Minneapolis. And it was a huge difference. And the women's game is great and competitive. And the stadium was sold out the whole weekend. And there should be investment in the women's game because it's very popular and a growing sport with great potential going forward. And then the third way that it's problematic, or another way in which it's problematic, is that if you assume, let me back up. If there were a college or a university that decided that it was going to reward money to one of its male teams, say basketball, based on how well that team does that season, and that there was no similar distribution for women, I think we could probably all agree that that on its face would be a Title IX violation. I don't think there's any college or university in the country who does that. And the reason they don't is because it would violate Title IX. While the NCAA in the Supreme Court has said this is not technically subject to Title IX, it seems to me that it's incongruous, particularly given the NCAA's gender equity commitment, to do something that, if it were a college or university doing it, would violate Title IX. And so obviously, if you're going to give money for one sport for men's success, you have to give money for women's success as well. Now, that leads to the next question, which is, do you have to do this at all? And on this, I really don't have an opinion. If the NCAA decided that it just didn't want to award any money based on relative success in basketball, it could do that, and I wouldn't see a gender equity problem. It could also, of course, go the opposite way. It could start offering success payments in other sports. And again, if it did it in other sports, it would have to offer, in our view, an analogous payment for the women's success in those sports as well. So how they distribute their money overall is not of our concern, at least for Kaplan Hecker, other than the fact that if they're going to do it based on men's success in any sport, including basketball, it's got to be gender equitable. Now, the more complicated question, as I just alluded to, is what do you do about this? How do you solve the problem? Let's assume you want to keep a payment for men's basketball or for men's basketball success in men's basketball. In our view, and this is something, again, reasonable people could disagree about it and have completely reasonable solutions. But in our view, it made sense for this to happen over time. And the reason it does is because these numbers are rolling numbers, and a lot of athletic departments at a lot of schools budget going into the future based on what they expect to receive from these funds. So it seemed to us, if you changed it in year one and made these distributions 50-50 between men and women, you have a lot of unhappy, as my parents would say, a lot of unhappy campers and a lot of member institutions who would not know how to cover their costs for their upcoming budgets. In our report, we spread it out 5% a year over 10 years. That's just a choice. You could do it over 5 years and 10% a year, or you could figure out another way. But we were just trying to we agree that it should be completely equitable as soon as possible. But we were trying to deal with the very practical problem that you have school athletic departments who have budgeted out for the next 5 or 6 years an expectation of receiving these funds. One of the analyses we did, however, to try to figure out how much disruption at least our proposal would have, is we ran the numbers, and you can go to the next chart, based on a relatively equal distribution over a 10-year period. And you can see that on these pie charts, which is, on these charts, which is actually 2 pages long. Can you show both, Andrew? Okay, we don't show one at a time. Surprisingly, and frankly, fortunately, the changes amongst the conferences were not that significant. There'd be a lot of conferences that would do better, Pacific, of course, obviously one of them. But even for the conferences, the relatively smaller number of conferences that would lose money, if you were to go to this scenario, none of them would lose more than 5%. And that's assuming, of course, that the success of the team stays the same, which obviously will change as the years go on. The final issue I wanted to touch on, because it's come up a lot in discussions, is where this money is coming from. And again, I don't really think that that was something that we were supposed to be looking at. Where the NCAA gets the money to do things is frankly an NCAA problem and was not part of the Kaplan Hecker report. And I don't think that the money, in order to make this equitable, should only come from increased revenues from the women's championship. I disagree with that as well. Equitable is equitable, and the money shouldn't differ based on contracts with CBS Turner or ESPN. However, it should make everyone somewhat more comfortable to know that there is a lot, in emphasis, a lot of untapped money with respect to the women's championships. And can you go to the final slide, Andrew? So in addition to our study, we had outside experts at the Dessler Sports Media Group look into the true valuation. If you were going to renegotiate everything today, what would be the valuation of the women's championship? And you'll see on this slide, and these are just pages taken out of the report, which is also available on our website. Please feel free to read it. But you'll see that the numbers range anywhere from $81 to $112 million per year that the NCAA should be getting from the women's championships. It's complicated because you have to both look at the sponsorships under CBS, which stay with CBS for the next several years, and the broadcasting contract at ESPN, which is separate. But there should be a way with creative minds and people acting in good faith for the NCAA to be able to recover a lot more money than it currently is recovering with respect to the women's championship. And again, let me just reiterate, I'm not saying that they shouldn't equalize things in terms of revenue distribution until this gets fixed. I'm just saying that this provides a cushion for the NCAA to use when they do, as I think they must, go to an equitable distribution model. I don't have anything else. I'm happy to answer questions about any of this, but I'm from New York, and so we speak very fast here. So I did that just now, but I hope everyone was able to follow.
Yeah, thank you, Roberta. Well done. A good review for all of us. Given that parts of this report were circulated to the commission in spite of the length of the entire report. So we want to open this conversation to questions by commissioners, and I'll try to create a queue here if one is necessary. So Pam, I'll recognize you, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for your report. That was very interesting, and I found it very interesting to read as well. My question is this. When you look at phase one of your report, it was focused really on men's and women's basketball, which currently provides, as you said, $0 for performance by women's basketball in the tournament. And you presented a possible remedy as being a women's basketball unit. So when we look at the Knight Commission's CARE model, which proposes implementing a gender equity principle that is overarching for these issues, it would require equal rewards for men's and women's sports teams if there is an athletics performance-based unit for both. Other remedies could be units for performance of multiple men's and women's sports. And one that you alluded to earlier is eliminating altogether performance-based units. So I wanted to see if you could speak just a little bit more on your views, particularly the latter issue of why not eliminate the performance-based units altogether, recognizing that for budget planning purposes, this may be something that has to be dealt with. But is there, in your view, is there wisdom in eliminating the performance-based unit altogether?
I personally, and I'm speaking here as Robbie Kaplan, I personally think that's a great idea. I think they would solve the easiest and cleanest way to solve gender equity problems with respect to distribution is to eliminate what I'm calling sports merits-based distributions altogether. Then you would have true equity, not only men's and women's true equity, but equity between the sports and equity between the conferences. The main problem, and I'm just trying to deal with the real world that we all live in, the main impediment to it, as you just pointed out, I think is the practicalities that many conferences and many schools are budgeting based on the expectation of receiving these numbers, which are quite high. It's not like they're insignificant sums. And so rather than creating an uproar among the schools who are expecting to see these monies going forward, I was hoping to phase in something more gradually. But assuming you could solve for that problem, there's no question in my mind that not having merits-based performance distributions would be completely equitable, both, as I said before, from a gender perspective, from an intersport perspective, and from an interconference perspective.
Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer, Robbie. That a lot of us on the commission probably agree with you. I do, however, want to deal in the real world for a minute. When you used in your report the example of women's basketball revenue distribution. You had that unit being phased in over a 10-year period. I think the commission would really like to see quicker responses to as remedies to the current inequity. And I'm wondering why you took the 10-year phased in approach, and could it be done more quickly if there was a will to do that?
So we understand, and my partner Gabrielle is here with me, she can correct me if I'm wrong, but our understanding is that these monies kind of roll over a 6-year period. So we thought we had to go at least to 6 years or beyond. And frankly, I'm gonna embarrass myself in answering this question. 10 just seemed like an easy round number, higher than 6. Honestly, the one thing that you'd want to look at if you went down to 6, for example, is you'd want to do an analysis, I think, like we did, to see how much variation the conferences could expect over what they expect to receive now. Again, we were pleased, and maybe I should say not that surprised, to see that I would expect the variations are not that significant. These are big conferences. They have lots of teams. Lots of the conferences, they have good men's teams, also have good women's teams. So there shouldn't be that much of a huge variation if you went to a 6-year model, but it's something you'd probably want to.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Walt. Others? Christine?
Thank you for the very thorough report, and as we know, it's already having an impact. But one point that's widely misunderstood is kind of the connection of where the money comes from to where it gets distributed. And I know you mentioned this, and as you said, in your very quick New York fashion, so I'm going to kind of ask again, perhaps something that you already mentioned. But the commission's position has been that where the money comes from in the NCAA revenue distribution is irrelevant, right? Because the NCAA is a nonprofit organization and our mission is education. So it's one pot of money, and the distribution of that revenue should be gender equitable. Gender equity and revenue distribution shouldn't depend on whether there are media contracts or not, or how big those contracts are for a given sport. So in your view, is there a relevance of the women's basketball contract to the issue of revenue distribution to be related to the women's basketball as well as men's?
No, I mean, I agree with you. As a matter of gender equity and frankly fairness, there should be no connection whatsoever between the money coming into the NCAA and the money being distributed to conferences, consistent with principles of gender equity. One of the reasons it's set up the way, I think the largest reason that it's set up the way it is something that we pointed to throughout our report. No one in our report is attributing intentional gender bias really to anyone at the NCAA. In our findings, if you read the whole report, you will see that what we think happened is that this kind of model based on huge amounts of money coming in, really only source of revenue every year coming in from the men's basketball team, and then the basketball tournament, excuse me, and then the NCAA believing kind of throughout the bones of the organization that in return for receiving those funds every year, money should not only go back to the men's game based on performance, but frankly, go back in a whole lot of other ways. Better go back to the weight rooms, better food, better branding at the tournament itself, better sponsorship arrangements, everything else. There was definitely a mentality that I think kind of just baked in over time, that the NCAA, at least with respect to tournaments, existed to facilitate and promote the men's basketball tournament kind of at the expense of everything else. So as a matter of gender equity, that is obviously logically incorrect. But I think it's very important for the future promotion and kind of worldview of women's sports that the obvious opportunities that exist for the NCAA making money and bringing revenue in from women's sports should be fully taken advantage of. For example, if you thought about it, if the NCAA even if we're a not-for-profit, much less a for-profit, even if we're just a regular old not-for-profit, the idea that all of its revenue is coming from just one source, the men's basketball tournament contracts, is not a healthy thing. And here we're in a world where we know for a fact, given the popularity of women's sports, that there is real revenue that can be obtained and achieved from women's basketball and probably from some of the other women's sports as well. And it is frankly, in my view, again, speaking as Robbie Kaplan, it's unfortunate, if not somewhat illogical, that the NCAA isn't taking full advantage of that. So the only reason I pointed it out, as I said before, was to show that there's a lot more money that can and should be coming in. But I agree, as a matter of gender equity, those two things should be separated, because gender equity is gender equity, and how much money you bring into the NCAA is how much money you bring into the NCAA. I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely. Thank you for the clarification.
So the logic of the money coming in and being distributed to the house, so to speak, you have any thoughts on the college football playoff revenues?
That's way outside my jurisdiction. We didn't really even look at football because the NCAA isn't really, the Division I is not really sponsoring those tournaments, kind of in the same way. So we didn't even look at football, but again, you know, and also with football, you have a problem because there's no female football teams. But putting those two big elephants in the room aside, the general principle should be, if money's going out to male teams for any reason, it should be going out to the analogous female teams for the same reason.
So I got one more. You may not be schooled in exactly what's happening right now, but we do have a transformation committee, and it is struggling to state a higher vision for where we want to end up 10 to 50 years down the road. If you were writing a part of that vision statement, I'm wondering what you'd say about gender equity.
So I believe fundamentally that while great strides, I guess we're coming up on the 50th anniversary this summer of Title IX, and why there's absolutely no question that great strides have been made as a result of Title IX and as a result of many of the women athletes like Billie Jean King and others who have spent their lives dedicated to the idea of gender equity in sports. And I don't think anyone can seriously question that there's a long, long way still to go. And that the reality of gender equity in college sports is not the same as the ideal that we all aspire to. And so from my perspective, a lot of work needs to be done, kind of big picture and kind of covering all sports, not only to make sure that there is true gender equity, both with respect to championships and any other area, but also because this will help lead to gender equity, making sure that the women's teams and the women's games are promoted and given the ability, the chance to succeed and to gain audiences and sponsorships and everything else in the way that I'm sure they can, but they need support and promotion in order to do so. And I think the assumption for too many years, and the reason I think that's important is because they will be seen as important when they're bringing in real amounts of money. And I think we have lived for too long in a world that just assumed women's sports was just something off the side, that women got to play, it was great, they were, you know, they had competition, good sportsmanship, et cetera, but they weren't really serious in terms of the real world, in terms of the money world, the way men's sports are. And I think we should all realize, as a practical matter, that's no longer true. Look at women's soccer, for example. And there's no reason why all colleges shouldn't be promoting women's sports and men's sports on equal terms going forward.
Others? Derek?
Yeah, I
Go
have one question.
Oh, Amy.
Robbie, in the report, and we've talked a lot about the athletics performance component of the basketball fund. And when you started, you also pointed out that 9% of the distribution, or 54 million a year, goes to Division I conferences on an equal basis based on the automatic qualification status for the men's basketball tournament. I think your report also speaks to that aspect. If you could just elaborate on that part.
Yeah, that's another easy one. Like if there's any money that goes to tournaments based on men's basketball status, the same kind of distribution should happen with respect to women's basketball status. And as of now, it's not happening. So that's an easy one, it seems to me, to either eliminate altogether or to make equitable.
Thank you. I think it is also in terms of just changing the language in terms of the qualification can be based on AQ in men's and women's basketball.
Exactly right. It's a very easy edit, the old-fashioned ways where you put a caret and add two words, and women's would solve that problem. Totally agree.
Thanks, Robbie.
So we are in the room, even though Robbie is virtual, but we have 7 or 8 people virtually listening to this session. And I just want to make sure that if there's any commentary or question in this regard, that we hear from you.
Let me add one other thing about women's basketball that we heard when we were doing our investigation, and I think this year's championship really contradicted in certain ways. We've been hearing, at least from some of the people we spoke to, that the women's game wasn't as competitive, it wasn't as exciting, and that explains some of the reasons why so much more attention and money was being directed toward the men. Again, I mean, I had the privilege of being in Minneapolis in person this year, but anyone who was watching those games, either the Final Four or the championship on TV, and anyone who watched the unbelievable performance of the South Carolina team led by Dawn Staley, could not possibly come to the conclusion that women's Division I NCAA basketball isn't incredibly competitive, doesn't have incredible room for growth, and it isn't an incredibly exciting game for people to watch. As I recall, the TV statistics this year for the women's game were higher than a lot of professional sports. So if one thing comes out of this, it's really a resource and a growth area that in my view is being sorely underutilized. And why that's important in terms of distribution is distribution obviously encourages schools and conferences to invest in the women's teams. And more of that needs to happen.
So you seem to be giving us a self-evident report here. It's taken a while to get here, but of those, you said obvious answer, but solutions might be difficult to implement. Do you have any opinion on any remaining hurdle to what looks like an obvious step our community should take?
So again, we want to do it. The one thing that we were very worried about in our report, and I think when you see some of the women basketball coaches speaking about these issues, they too are concerned about it, is this should not be a zero-sum game. That's really what I'm trying to say about the DESA report and the work they did. Adding equity for women should not be taking away equity or taking anything away, frankly, from the men's game. And as you move forward in terms of solutions, I would be very cognizant of that perceived tension. I don't think it's a real tension, that perceived tension, because I think to the extent that people think it's a fight between men's basketball and women's basketball, we're doing both men's and women's basketball a great disservice. These are great sports for both men and women that have great potential, and that potential should be exploited by the conferences, the schools, and the NCAA to the greatest extent possible.
So, Robbie, as you know, this is a 2-part presentation, and we hope that we'll have your wisdom throughout. I want to thank you on behalf of Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink, whom you represent, and the good work that you've done, and for joining us today. But assuming you will stick around, well, we're going to now move to the segment of the session where we will assess the academic performance incentives to the revenue distribution plan. And I'll turn to my co-chair, Lynn Elmore, to introduce this part of the session. So thank you again, Robbie. And Lynn?
Thank you for having me. And I'm not going anywhere.
Good.
All right. Thank you, Nancy. Welcome to the Knight Commission presentation on altering NCAA revenue distribution to correct racial equity. I'm joined today by fellow Commissioner Dr. Christine Copper, as well as Todd Petr, founder and project lead for Total Analytics Performance, and Dr. Chris Brown, our research consultant for our commission. To begin, I'd like to thank the co-chairs, Christine and Walt Harrison, and all the members of the Knight Commission's Athlete Issues and Educational Mission Committee for their work in preparing for today's presentation. Now, as the commission knows, and hopefully we can enlighten the public, the Knight Commission believes in the importance and life-changing role athletics plays in the experiences of college athletes, and more broadly, the role athletics plays in our universities and communities. Like 2/3 of my colleagues here on the commission who were college athletes, I was profoundly moved and shaped by my experience at the University of Maryland, both on and off the basketball court. The Knight Commission work is driven by values. We believe the college sports model must better prioritize the education, health, safety, and success of college athletes. Now, for more than 3 decades, the Knight Commission has championed transformational change in the college sports. The Commission's 2021 report entitled Achieving Racial Equity in College Athletics continued this tradition and seeks to redress racial inequities that permeate college sports. The report included 4 overarching recommendations to improve the experience of Black college athletes. Now, for the purpose of today, we're going to focus on the first recommendation, closing educational opportunity gaps to create an equitable pathway for Black athletes' success during and after college. Now, it's important to note that before continuing, the Knight Commission Racial Equity Task Force, which I co-chaired with Commission members Shantiana Keys and Jacques McClendon, focused on Black athletes in particular, because Black athletes in college are both the largest racial minority in Division I and the minority group with the largest negative graduation gap compared to the graduation rate of white athletes. Our report title intentionally included the words, moving pledges to policy. So before we move forward, I'm pleased to update you on actions that have taken place since the publication of the Commission's Achieving Racial Equity report. The Commission recommended that the NCAA should eliminate the use of standardized testing to determine first-year athletics eligibility. A group of commissioners, along with Knight Commission consultants, were able to speak to the NCAA Standardized Test Task Force and provide further support for this recommendation. And in April 2022, the NCAA Division I Council introduced legislation into the 22-23 legislative cycle to remove the standardized test score requirement from initial eligibility requirements. The report further stated that the NCAA should require institutions to establish a designation equivalent to the senior woman administrator position to represent the best interests of college athletes of color. And recently, the NCAA Council, with support from the NCAA Minority Opportunities and Interests Committee and Men's and Women's Basketball Oversight Committees, advanced a proposal in the NCAA legislative cycle that requires conferences and institutions to designate a senior minority athletics administrator. And finally, the Knight Commission will fund independent research to examine if institutions with large racial graduation gaps in their GSR scores in one or more sports are qualifying for financial awards through the NCAA's new academic incentive program. And if so, whether the NCAA should institute an additional standard for schools to receive funding for meeting academic benchmarks. That research is complete, and it is why we are making a recommendation that will incentivize schools to correct the racial equity gap in graduation success rates. Now, again, before we get to our research results and the recommendation, I'll turn the floor over to Knight Commission's Athlete Issues and Educational Mission Committee co-chair, Dr. Christine Copper, to discuss the current model of financial incentives tied to academic success.
Thank you, Len, and good morning, everybody. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of serving as the co-chair for the 2015 NCAA Values-Based Revenue Distribution Working Group. And we created the Academic Performance Fund that's now rewarding schools for academic success. Before we get to our recommendation today, I'll briefly review the NCAA's current revenue distribution plan for rewarding academic success. While the Knight Commission had recommended tying academic success to financial incentives in 2001, it took until 2016 for this change to come to fruition. Between 2021 and 2032, more than $1.1 billion will be allocated for academic success. This is a significant amount of money. Therefore, it's imperative that schools receiving this money are also ensuring the graduation of all college athletes driving these funds. On this slide, we demonstrate how an institution currently qualifies to receive performance incentive, or what we now know as the academic unit. As this policy was being developed, the Values-Based Revenue Distribution Working Group determined that multiple academic measures should be used to ensure a diverse pool of institutions would qualify for this academic unit. The working group prioritized using metrics familiar to the membership and to the general public. Therefore, the choice was made to use the academic progress rate, or APR, the graduation success rate, or GSR, and the federal graduation rate. So as you can see in the graphic, to obtain the academic unit, an institution must meet only one of these three standards. The first one being the APR for the previous year equal to or greater than 985, or the GSR for the most recent year equal to or greater than 90%, or finally, the difference between student athlete and student body percentages in the most recently published federal graduation rate is equal to or greater than 13 percentage points. It's important to note that these benchmarks were originally selected so that approximately 2/3 of the membership could achieve an academic unit. Therefore, the receipt of an academic unit was in no way intended to be our participation trophy. It was actually designed to change behavior. And as Todd is about to show you, the academic incentives are working, and there's improvement in the scores for APR and GSR. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Todd Petr, and he's going to share the research he conducted demonstrating how the top quartile has changed since the adoption of this academic unit. He'll also share a summary of the racial equity gap data that the commission reviewed to make its recommendation today. So Todd.
Thanks, Christine. As Christine mentioned, the 75th percentile for schools has changed since the initial recommendation was made by the committee on which Christine and others here sat on. And schools have increased or now 75% or 25, the top 25% in the GSR has jumped from 90% GSR to 95%. As you can see, 985 used to be the line for the top quartile. Now 989 is that line. And as we see here, the federal grad rate difference between student athletes and the student body has actually dropped. Now, of course, all of this could be seen as good news, but I think there's still room to grow and changes that can be considered in all of these issues. We move to the next slide. This shows the total number of institutions that qualified for the academic unit based on each of the three standards, beginning with the 2015 data on which the standards were initially based. And then what the most recent data is 2019. The reason that is the NCAA has not publicly released APR data during the COVID period for a variety of probably very viable reasons. These numbers don't add up to, I mean, schools can qualify in more than one situation. So this takes each of the benchmarks individually in looking at that. The last row is non-duplicated. That is the total number of schools that met one or more of the standards that are part of the qualification. When, as Christine mentioned, when the values-based revenue distribution working group designed these benchmarks, they set approximately two-thirds of Division I would see the benefits, or would see the actual financial benefit from this. They did not, again, as Christine mentioned, want to make it a, everyone gets a trophy kind of thing. Schools have, for a variety of reasons, obviously met the new standards in larger numbers than was anticipated when they were initially put into place. And that's an important issue that we'll discuss again when Chris talks about, I think, the committee recommendations and where the committee thinks we should go from here. Finally, on this slide, this shows what we're talking about. Where are we on the next one? Yeah. We looked at the distribution of the black-white difference in grad success rates specifically here. And the distribution of where all of the 350 Division I institutions fall in that gap between, and this is across all sports, men's, women's, the whole shooting match. And as you can see, 56% of all Division I institutions had less than a 10 percentage point gap between black and white student athletes. And then there were additional 87 that fell between 11 and 20%, 20 more between 21 and 25%. So you can see that, and there were 7 that actually had greater than 50% differences in that rate. And those all had, I want to clarify, if for instance, a student an institution did not have one racial group or the other, they were counted as a 0 difference. So these institutions all had, and there are a few of those that actually met that, but these institutions all had both black and white student athletes. And so this was a distributional, you can sum the data in the left-hand column. If you start at 25% as a maximum, which is important here, you'll see that you sum those 19, 11, 10, 7, that's 47 institutions that didn't have it, that had less than a 25%, or sorry, more than a 25% gap in that rate. I'm going to turn it over to Chris now to take us through the next slides.
Thank you, Todd. The commission truly appreciates your outstanding research. After reviewing Todd's data, the Knight Commission asked the question, what would be the result of a new racial equity standard as a filter to achieve academic units? For the purpose of today, a racial equity standard is defined as a designated maximum percentage point gap between black and white college athlete graduation success rates among qualifying institutions. Under the current structure, an institution may have a sizable racial graduation gap in GSR and still receive an academic unit. To correct this gap, the criteria to receive financial academic incentives must consider these data. For example, using the 2019 data, 278 Division I institutions qualified for the academic unit. We studied this information to understand the impact of a racial equity benchmark by applying varying thresholds. If the 25 percentage point maximum gap between black and white college athlete GSRs had been applied in 2019, 231 institutions would qualify for the academic unit. This is a reduction of 47 schools. Now, if a maximum filter is to be used, it really is imperative that that data be evaluated on a regular basis. or at least every 4 years. We must remember that the ultimate goal is to move towards decreasing the percentage gap altogether. The present slide demonstrates the estimated impact of a racial equity benchmark applied to the 278 schools that would qualify for the academic unit in 2019. The data are further broken down by NCAA Division I subdivisions. So for example, 77% of FBS institutions would have qualified for the academic unit. If the racial equity benchmark had been applied, only 63% of FBS institutions would have qualified for the academic unit. To be more specific, this tells us that 14% of the schools that qualified for the academic unit in 2019 had a gap between the GSR for white and Black athletes of more than 25 percentage points. If we look even further, there is a 20% drop in qualifying institutions among the non-autonomy 5 schools. Specifically, 71% of the non-autonomy 5 institutions qualified for the academic unit. However, with the application of the racial equity benchmark, the percentage of qualifying non-autonomy 5 institutions drops to 51%. While historically Black colleges and universities are not considered an NCAA Division I subdivision, we wanted to ensure that the data reflected the impact on these institutions as well. Of the HBCUs who qualified for the academic unit in 2019, all would still retain the unit using the racial equity benchmark. Now, the Knight Commission is recommending that the NCAA Academic Performance Fund add a new standard for an NCAA Division I school to qualify for an academic unit. Specifically, schools would first need to demonstrate that any percentage point gap in graduation success rate between Black and white college athletes is not greater than 25 percentage points. Once this racial equity standard is met, the institution can then be considered for an academic unit by meeting the current NCAA criteria. The selection of 25% threshold aligns with the intent of the original NCAA values-based revenue distribution working group that sought to ensure that 2/3 of the membership would be eligible for an academic unit. The Commission's focus is to eliminate the racial equity gap completely. Therefore, it is recommended that the 25 percentage point standard be evaluated every 3 to 4 years in an effort to tighten the standard as more schools achieve the threshold. As stated, the ultimate goal is to eliminate the gap and achieve racial equity as it relates to college athlete graduation success. The change has the potential to have a meaningful impact on achieving racial equity and realigning the academic unit with its intended values-based outcome. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Lynn Elmore for some closing comments.
Well, thank you all, Christine, Todd, and Chris. Your diligence in preparing this research for review by the Knight Commission is greatly appreciated and really has led us to this important recommendation. Now, let me emphasize, a school's graduation gap between white and Black athletes is a critical test of racial equity. As I mentioned earlier, Black college athletes are both the largest racial minority in Division I and the minority group with the largest negative graduation gap compared to the graduation rate of white athletes. Now, our research has revealed an indefensible Black-white athlete graduation gap among schools that qualify for academic awards. And the NCAA should stop sending millions of dollars to schools that fail to close those gaps. Now, right now, I hope that we'll have some participation, but here's an opportunity for our commission members and anyone who wants to ask some questions or make comments to be able to do so now. And just a moment for any media who may not have questions ready now, but wants to ask questions later. We have a 12:45 press conference at which time you'll have an opportunity to be able to ask questions. So at this time, I'll open up the floor for any questions, comments from the commissioners. Chris?
Thank you, Len. Thank you all for a very fulsome research report. And, I think I jokingly said that as a former university president and university executive and working in a lot of different areas, The 3-point GPA is now just as important as a 3-point jump shot. And that's a good thing. And I think we're creating the appropriate incentives to align with what universities and colleges need to do. So my question is, if I saw that one slide, Chris, that you put up, and I was suspecting that perhaps the greatest disparity between Black and white graduation rates might be amongst some of our schools that were less resourced than some of the other schools. And it seems to be borne out that the non-autonomous, the group of 5 and the FCS schools, and I ran an FCS school until very recently, are the ones that have the greater disparity. Any discussion around resources that would be allocated to those schools? Because I will tell you that most of them probably want to do the right thing in terms of providing the resources to assist students to address that gap. It's real. I mean, there's X amount of dollars you have to do these sorts of things. I was wondering if you all thought about that as you were doing your analysis.
Yeah, so we did discuss in terms of looking at the data, the impact potentially on a lack of resources could have as it relates to having a gap between your Black and white college athletes and their graduation success rate. Certainly, we did acknowledge that, and in previous recommendations with this group, acknowledged that there is a lack of resources being provided to these institutions, and that the NCAA should ramp up funding to help institutions through potentially their AASP program. But in looking at the data, we really found that in particular, those institutions in particular will use historically Black colleges and universities who historically would not meet some of these benchmarks, would not be adversely impacted by this particular threshold. And so for that reason, we felt comfortable moving this direction, but we did engage in conversation around the lack of resources as being a reason for potentially there being a gap.
If I can just add something, I think your hunch is correct, first of all. In looking both at the reaction that the increase in schools that met the current qualification, the highest increase was in the autonomy group. And as you can see here, they're much more likely to meet the gap standard, which is good, not a bad thing. But NCA's I had a very, I think, successful program with this AASP, but that really focuses on very low resource institutions. There is no FBS institution that would qualify under the current regulations for ASP money. But that doesn't mean that there couldn't be, a change in how that operates, or, I'm not sufficiently prepared to say how you might do that right now, but those institutions kind of fall into a gap where they have a lot less money than the 5 autonomy conferences, but really don't have access to further funding outside of the basketball distribution, whatever they get from their conferences.
Are there any other questions? Jonathan?
Well, first a comment and then a question. I really appreciate the work that you've done here. I would note that this is an issue more broadly for institutions. A lot of our accrediting agencies are looking at these retention and graduation gaps based on race and other factors and telling us we need to disaggregate our data and study this and close the gap. So it's very consistent with something happening in higher education more generally. I guess my question is trying to think through, one question you've already dealt with, thinking about what types of institutions might be adversely affected. But did you think about any other unintended consequences if this were put into effect? Things that institutions might do that are not what we want them to do in order to close the gap, whether that is in recruiting or, it's like with the metrics that you see in US News, for example, where schools try to game the system in various ways, right? Did you talk about any other unintended consequences that we need to be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so we certainly did have those conversations, and certainly recognizing that the standard was set, and we noticed that a number of schools were able to very quickly meet that standard. And so there was a recognition that if this change were put in place, that there might be, for lack of a better term, some gamesmanship in terms of trying to beat the system or do some things, as you're alluding to, that might result in meeting the standard but not doing it the proper way. With that said, we had a lot of those conversations, but felt as though we wouldn't be able to get at every single scenario, just like the previous form of this particular unit, but wanting to make sure that we were doing the right thing by our college athletes and making sure that we're closing that gap and putting things in place to ensure that institutions are being held accountable for closing this gap. But I think, to your exact point, there will probably be unintended consequences, but I think the end result with a filter such as this are worth those unintended consequences, and we can address those as they come about.
Yeah, just to kind of elaborate on that, our report, Achieving Racial Equity, essentially sets the framework. And we assume institutional integrity. If people are going to go beyond that, that's a whole different story. And, you know, I guess there are safeguards to a certain extent, but again, the assumption of institutional integrity with a framework should be able to solve those.
And the idea when we, the working group that I co-chaired with the values-based revenue distribution that came up with the academic unit in the first place was to try to change behavior, right? Was to try to give, basically put some money out there that people would try to get by upping their academic game, right? And we mentioned a few times this 2/3, you know, it wasn't meant to be everybody gets a trophy. It was meant in the first place that 2/3 of the schools would be able to qualify for this academic unit. Quite honestly, that number to me personally seemed a little high at the time, but it also needed to be high enough that our working group's work got approved by the membership so that it was even possible and people would even approve it and have it come to be. And now we see it grow and behavior changing. So the idea behind any of this is, you know, once there's money out there, you can change behavior, and hopefully with the values that schools, you know, they have values that they talk about, and hopefully now they will put their actions behind that. And if we can nudge them along a little bit with a financial incentive, then all the better, because in the end, the students end up coming out better off.
Nancy?
So to link this conversation, both gender equity and racial equity, to the standing transformation committee, see any reason why these two proposals would not fare well in the visioning process of the transformation committee? Or have you had access to these reports and had presentations on them so that we could assume safely that at whatever level this is appropriate, it would come out in support of these two recommendations? And I'm, for those of you, Kendall Spencer and Gloria Naravas are on the commission or on the committee, so they're well prompt to answer that question, I think. One of you, either of you?
I wasn't sure if Amy, were you going to, okay. So my understanding is we've had delegates from the Knight Commission meet with the co-chairs, but as of yet, the full proposals have not been introduced into the room. But again, we've not yet gotten to revenue distribution and global membership standards within the Transformation Committee.
Just adding one point, the recommendation that's been presented here today, approved by the commission and will be discussed later in the press conference. It's timely as well because the NCAA Committee on Academics that oversees this program has announced that it will be looking at the criteria. And so certainly, you know, the commission's view is to put forward actionable recommendations that can be acted upon immediately, frankly, within the current governance structure, the current Division I Board of Directors, and based on the fact that these are based on, you know, principles that are part of the new NCAA Constitution, we don't see any reason why they can't be moved forward under the current system.
Len, we have a number of questions from the webinar participants.
Okay.
From Morgan Shaw, one of the observations in the commission's initial racial equity report was the clustering of majors. To Todd, Christine, or Chris, was the data you presented able to observe or identify any clustering of athletes in certain majors in those schools with greater than 25% graduation gap between Black and white athletes?
I did not currently have access to data that would allow me to do that. I will point you to the NCAA website. There is a interactive dashboard that looks at majors, student body versus student athletes. Overall, as I recall, clustering is less an issue than I think a lot of people think. There are certainly places where student athletes tend to be more prevalent, but of course, you're talking majority men and lots of different maybe factors, underlying factors that may determine. One that springs right to my mind is there are more business majors in the student athlete population. I can't recall off the top of my head if that dashboard, I know it has a gender selection. I can't recall if it has race ethnicity selection. My guess is that it would. But that's certainly something I think we can dig further into down the road as needed. But right now, the best data that I'm aware of are right there on the NCAA website, probably on the research page.
One other question from Steve Parker. Have you taken in account of the number of athletes that leave early to go into the pros? And have you anticipated the effect of graduation rates with regard to the transfer portal? Todd?
Yeah, the GSR takes into account the transfer issue and deals with the going pro issue in my mind more effectively and realistically than the federal graduation rate, where if you leave an institution, you are a non-graduate, whether you transfer and graduate elsewhere, whether you seek your fortune in the NBA, whatever it may be. The GSR has components that try to address those issues, as transfer, as we all know, is an issue across higher ed. It's not just among athletes. In fact, the last data we ran, the NCAA ran a study with the Gallup, and the transfer rate among non-athlete students was significantly higher than the rate among student athletes. Having said that, obviously we sort of have an experiment and a natural experiment occurring with the transfer portal. I think my colleagues at the NCAA would tell you it's not as dramatic a difference as a lot of people think since the portal's been open, but they're definitely, I think in pockets, especially if we think football and basketball, I think we have seen increases. But that's something, again, I think in the recommendation of the commission here, that mandated periodic evaluation these are dynamic numbers. These change for a lot of different reasons. And so a periodic evaluation is an important component of the recommendation for sure.
One clarification before we close this session. Again, both segments of this public session address modifying the Division I revenue distribution. That, as folks know, that distribution is more than $600 million annually, going back to Division I schools, and the segments of the distribution that we talked about here today equal in sum over $200 million annually, considering the athletic performance incentives and the academic performance incentives. So just wanted to make that clarification.
All right, thank you, Amy. At this time, this concludes our public session, and I want to thank everyone who participated today. The media, you're reminded that we're going to have a press conference at 12:45 p.m. and our co-chair, Arnie Duncan, will certainly participate in that session. Again, my thanks to everyone for engaging with us today.